History is a vast, confusing, and compelling network of ideas and concepts that influence every person's entire life. History has the power to mold our future and present in extremely fascinating ways.
So when several months ago I saw this short video,
Everything is about tuberculosis. Why did New Mexico become a state? Tuberculosis.
I was immediately compelled to learn more. John Green then goes on to make several points about tuberculosis and its societal impacts throughout history. But before we analyze this, it's important to understand what tuberculosis is. Tuberculosis is an airborne infectious disease with two major classifications. First, latent tuberculosis. Latent tuberculosis is a dormant form of tuberculosis, meaning it does not deteriorate the immune system. And secondly, active tuberculosis. Out of the 1.8 billion people in our world currently affected by tuberculosis, 10 million of these people have an active form of the disease. Tuberculosis deteriorates tissue, reducing constitution and increasing the risk of other infections to occur. Tuberculosis is theorized to have existed as a microbacterium for over 3 million years. It was first referenced directly in India close to 3,000 years ago, and it was first referenced with a name in ancient Greek times when it was given the label physis. Now let's get back to that video.
Everything is about tuberculosis. Why did New Mexico become a state? Tuberculosis. Why do doctors have stethoscopes? Tuberculosis.
And then the most fascinating claim.
Why did women's hemlines get shorter in the early 20th century to reveal the ankle? Tuberculosis.
I did a sort of double take at that moment. It's when I knew I needed to start tracing the path of tuberculosis throughout history. So I began my research, starting with the facts and gaining a baseline understanding of tuberculosis and its effects. It's the Victorian era. Tuberculosis is the plague of the times, and it's responsible for 1 out of every 7 deaths. It's believed to be an inherited condition, and strangely, it's associated with a deep emotional capacity. For these reasons, it was highly romanticized during the time period. Now, it's important to identify that tuberculosis was romanticized in very gendered ways. For men, it was seen as a means of quickening genius, like in the case of poet Robert Keats, who was said to have improved drastically as a poet in the last year of his life. But for women, it was the catalyst of a new standard of beauty that has a grip on our world even to this day. Women dying of tuberculosis were often very thin due to a lack in appetite caused by its effect on the brain. They had very sullen and large eyes due to the tension and thinner skin caused by the disease, and rosy cheeks and a pale complexion due to the fever associated with the consumption. During this time, a consumptive palate was desirable, and many women began to consume less food and use a form of rice powder to achieve paler skin. Some magazines at this time recommended belladonna, a toxic plant in the nightshade family, to be applied to the eyelids in order to dilate pupils and achieve the wide-eyed look of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was terrible and not at all like its romanticized forms, but those customs and traditions that were developed in the Victorian era are still with us today in so many ways. Fast forward a few decades, a man named Robert Koch is gaining traction on an idea he had conceptualized several years before on March 24th, 1882. Tuberculosis is a bacterial infection.
It's the Roaring '20s, and with this new idea in circulation, and the news rapidly spreading, fears grew about how tuberculosis might be spreading. Here's where we find the answer to that earlier question.
Why did women's hemlines get shorter in the early 20th century to reveal the ankle? Tuberculosis.
The 20s was a time of parties, celebration, dressing up. So when people began to realize that they were tracking diseases like tuberculosis and other conditions into their homes to affect their families, changes started to be made. Now, what is most fascinating about this is how it still affects us today. This was over 100 years ago now, and this information has been largely forgotten. But that's the wonderful thing about history. There's always a new connection. In this case, we find that connection through fashion. Because of the raise in dress hem length, a new item was revealed for the first time, the shoe.
Without tuberculosis, we may not have created the shoe fashion industry, and the creation of some of the most successful brands and symbols of our era may not have occurred. Now, this is mostly speculation, but the cause and effect is quite prominent, and we identify it in other examples as well.
For instance, as John Green claimed, New Mexico achieved statehood primarily as a result of tuberculosis. In the late 19th century, New Mexico made its original attempts to become a state. It met all the required criteria. It was already a territory. It had a sufficient number of people, but there was one prominent issue, the issue of race. New Mexico was primarily occupied by people other states did not identify as being worthy of statehood. Much of its population was indigenous or Spanish-speaking, and for this reason, it was denied during its original attempts. The leadership of New Mexico devised a campaign to bring these white individuals to New Mexico. They began to advertise the clean desert air as a cure for tuberculosis. You could bring your Sikh family member out west to breathe the clean air, and it would do its part to relieve the condition. And then, by 1912, close to 10% of New Mexico's population was white people with tuberculosis, seeking their cure, and statehood was approved.
With all of these historical examples and the past tense language that comes with them, and the fact that we as a society don't really need to worry about tuberculosis, we gain the false impression that it's not a modern issue. But it's important to remember that in 2020, tuberculosis was still the second largest cause of death behind only COVID-19. And an estimated 1.6 to 2 million people die of tuberculosis and tuberculosis-related factors every year. That's right, tuberculosis, a highly treatable condition with a vaccine almost every American still gets at birth, kills millions yearly. Why? Because when the BCG tuberculosis vaccine, the original vaccine created for tuberculosis, was originally created in 1921, development was simply stopped. The vaccine was affordable enough for Americans and other first world countries to obtain. Why would we need to develop a more cost-effective solution? Why attempt to find a more effective cure or vaccine? Tuberculosis still kills millions, and yet because it's not a problem we think about daily or that affects us in many ways, why would we need to improve our solution? Here's why. Tuberculosis is a societal disease. It's completely treatable, and it doesn't need to be a significant problem. But because of the manner in which it is addressed, tuberculosis is still a terrible condition that affects our ancestors and the people of our worlds for hundreds of years. Understanding the way it affected those people can help us balance our response to future complications, and maybe then we can make the changes that need to be made for now.